I was first exposed to cars when I turned 16. Uh, my father was a builder in Modesto, and he was very conservative. My mother was a teacher, and it was always instilled in us kids that we were going to go to college. And so my dad put together a little plan whereby that he would buy us, each of us three kids, a car, not a new car, but a good used car that would get us through high school and get us through college. And after that, we were on our own. And my brother, who was a scholar, he got straight A's in high school. When he turned 16, my dad bought him a 56 Ford two-door business coupe, 6-cylinder, 3-speed. And he was very happy with it. When I turned 16, a year and a half later, I told Dad, I said, I really would like to have something a little nicer. My brother, even though he was smart, he was not mechanical. You know, I was very mechanical and liked to work with my hands, and I like cars. And I hung around with guys that like cars. And so we found a 1950 Pontiac Catalina coupe. Very pretty car. And we bought it. And so consequently, the first thing I did is I went down to Pep Boys and bought a set of lowering blocks and was installing them. My dad came home and he says, "What are you doing?" And I says, "Well, I'm gonna lower the car." And he says, "Well, that thing's gonna ride like a buckboard." And I said, "Yeah, Dad, but it's gonna look good." And my buddies and I, and then again, this is really the start of American Graffiti, what we would do, we would work on our cars, get them all shined up, polished up, and then we'd go down and drag 10th Street. And there was two reasons that we'd drag 10th Street. Number one is that it was two-way street, but Sears and Penny's and Montgomery Ward's, they all had these big glass windows. And we could actually go down and we see the reflection of our cars in the windows. And we thought that was really great. I can still remember when I bought a set of flicker hubcaps and put them on my car. And oh man, did that look good. The second reason, and probably maybe more important, was the fact that the girls, they would all get together, get into a car and drag 10th Street. And so what we would do is that we found some girls that we wanted to talk to. We'd try to get to the stoplight together with them and make arrangements to meet up at Burgess Drive-In, which is down at the end, and have a cherry Coke, and French fries. So anyhow, that was my first exposure. The Pontiac Catalina, it had a cast iron straight 8 engine, so it was very heavy on the front end, and so consequently it didn't stop good and it didn't handle well. And so consequently, when we would leave at night, we'd have a little game of ditch and we'd let somebody take off, and everybody would try to catch them. And so when I was racing through the streets of Modesto, I'd come into a corner, you know, put on the brakes, turn the wheel, wait a few seconds, and the car would around the corner, and so obviously didn't handle very well. Well, a good friend of mine in high school named Jeff Puccinelli, his dad was a banker, and bought him a new MGA. And so he and a couple other rich kids that had Triumphs and Don Thiel had a Porsche Speedster. They were going to go for a ride up in the Sierra Nevada, and he asked me if I wanted to ride along. And so I said, absolutely. And so on the way back, he asked me if I wanted to drive. And I said, sure, I would love to. And I just couldn't believe it. I got behind that wheel and came into the first corner, put on the brakes. The car actually stopped. I turned the wheel, it turned, the car didn't lean, the tires didn't squeal, and I was hooked. And so consequently, I just had to get a sports car. And so consequently, I sold my Pontiac and a couple of other cars I was working on, and bought a new Austin Healey in 1959, yes. And so at the time, there was a group of us that had sports cars. We had a little club called a Curie AWOL. And that's where I met George Lucas. George, we went to the same high school, but George, I was 4 years older than George, and so we weren't in the same class. And I didn't know George until I met him in this little club called the Curie AWOL. And we'd all get together and go to autocrosses throughout Northern California and compete. And with my Austin Healey, I could win my class, but I really wanted to set fast time of the day. And there was a guy in Stockton called Ted Herman that had an AC Bristol. And whenever he showed up, which wasn't very often, he could set fast time of the day. So I determined that I needed to get an AC Bristol. So I was able to find a used AC Bristol, and I got it fixed up. And I think I was one of the very first ones to put anti-roll bars or sway bars on an AC chassis. And with that AC chassis, I could basically, when I showed up at an autocross, I could basically win and set fast time. And so consequently, as a result, I decided I wanted to get into road racing. And so at the time, you had to be 21. When I turned 21, I got the car, prepared it, and started road racing it. And I was very successful. And George Lucas we became good friends. And George went to every single race with me in the AC Bristol, all the way starting in San Diego up to Seattle. And we basically went to the World's Fair, and we won 12 out of 14 races. And then my folks were after me to go back to college, and so consequently, I decided to go back to college, which I did in the fall of 1962. And I enrolled in Fresno State. In the meantime, it had taken me 3 years to get through 2 years of junior college in Modesto, because I was playing with my cars and doing autocrossing and racing. And it was during this period of time that Bristol quit making engines for AC cars, and so consequently Shelby got a hold of AC cars in England, and basically wanted to know if they could build a car or take that car and reinforce it enough to be able to put a small block Ford in it. In the meantime, they said great, they thought it was a good idea. And of course then Shelby went back and then he went to Ford and said, oh, I got AC cars, to build a chassis that'll take the small block, will you supply the engines? And it was a kind of a typical Shelby deal, and anyhow, that's how the Cobra came to be.
You want to talk a little bit about your involvement now with racing with Shelby?
Okay. During this period of time, again, I was taking a little paper magazine that was called Competition Press, which became Auto Week. And I was reading about Shelby and the fact that he was going to be putting a small block Ford in the AC chassis. And so during semester break, I went down to Los Angeles in Venice and offered my services to Shelby. And Shelby looked at me and he basically said, well, have you ever raced before? And of course that was the wrong question to ask me. I told him about every race I'd ever won, and he finally said, well, Alan, he says, I've got Phil Hill and I've got Dan Gurney, and he says, I don't need any drivers right now, but we're looking for welders. Can you weld? Well, fortunately, I'd worked for a gentleman by the name of Louis Borges at Borges Welding Works in Modesto, and I knew how to weld. And so because of that, he took me back and introduced me to Phil Remington, and Phil hired me as a welder. They soon found out I had a couple years of college, and so they moved me upstairs, and I shared an office with Peter Brock, who designed the Daytona coupe, and it was right next door to Carroll's office. And so I got to know Carroll very well, and so consequently, part of my job My title was Production Control Manager, and I was ordering cars from AC Cars, and I was also selling cars to my dealers throughout the U.S. My biggest dealer was Coventry Motors in Walnut Creek, and it was owned by Jay Brown and Jerry Stokes. And Jay called one day and said, "Hey, we want to buy a race car." And I said, "Well, Jay," I said, "I've only got one rebuilt factory race car, and I'll sell it to you under one condition." And it got real quiet, and he says, "Well, what would that be?" And I says, "Well, I want to drive it." And again, it got real quiet, and he finally says, "Have you ever raced before?" And so consequently, I says, "Well, call SCCA in San Francisco," and I said, "You'll find that I raced the AC Bristol last year, and I won 12 out of 14 races and was Rookie of the Year." And I says, "Furthermore, you got to put up an extra $500 because I want to build a special engine because I want to blow off the factory team." And so that got him really excited. And so he basically went ahead and bought the car. And the irony of it is that as I look back, and I still have a copy of the check, when he actually paid for it, with a check from Commercial Credit. Commercial Credit was flooring his new cars, and Commercial Credit was under the impression that this was a car that was going to be sitting on the showroom floor, when in fact we were out racing it. So anyhow, then I called George Lucas and told him that Coventry Motors was going to buy this car and that they were going to race it. And so he got into his Corvette. At the time I was living in Santa Monica. George came down and slept on my couch, and we basically talked about what color we wanted to paint it. And we decided, since the factory was actually, race cars were black and dark blue, that was before they changed to the Guardsman blue with the white stripes, we decided that we needed to paint it yellow. And not just any yellow, but DuPont tinting yellow, so it was really bright. And so it would stand out in the field. And so George ended up designing the paint scheme that was with the black stripes going across the hood and back at a 45-degree angle, which has been written up. And Dave Friedman, who's written many books on the Cobra, claims that it was the prettiest racing Cobra ever, and it's been written up in many magazines and many books. So our first race was at Santa Barbara, and that was in 1963 in September. And we went up there and we won both days there. Then we went up into the next race was in San Francisco at Candlestick Park in the parking lot. And we entered that race and we won both days up there. And then my next race was a big race. It was going to be at Riverside Raceway, and I was going to be racing against the factory team. And so consequently, we'd actually built this new motor and put a little different cam in it. And we got out to the racetrack, and I'd never raced at Riverside, being from Northern California. I'd never raced at Riverside before, and so I didn't know the track. And so I was out during practice, and in our haste to put the new motor in, we didn't tighten one of the lower radiator hoses, and during practice when it warmed up, the radiator hose came off, and so consequently I didn't get hardly any practice at all. So I ended up qualifying fourth. It was actually Dan Gurney was on the pole, Bob Bondurant, Lou Spencer were in the factory Cobras, and then myself, and then Richie Ginther in a GTO Ferrari. And so I knew that I had to get a good start, and I needed to get behind Gurney, because Gurney grew up at Riverside and knew the track better than anybody in the world. And I figured that I would follow him, learn the track from him, and then pass him and win the race. Well, everything worked out really good. They dropped the flag. Gurney got a good start. I got a good start. It went right between Bondurant and Spencer, and was right on Gurney's tail going into turn 6, when all of a sudden Bondurant stuck his nose inside me. I was in a full drift, and he tapped me, spun me out, and I had to wait for all 30 cars to go by. In the meantime, my dream had gone up in smoke, and I took off and drove like there was no tomorrow. In fact, the LA Times, when they wrote up about the race the next day, said, and Grant went through the field like a constipated bull. and I went from dead last and ended up finishing second. And so I was, at the end of the race, I was so irritated. If it had lasted one more lap, I'd have won the race. But in the meantime, the announcer had just gone crazy, checking the time, how much I was gaining each lap, and whether or not I was going to be able to catch the leader, etc. And when I got into the pits after the race, I was going to punch Bondurant out. But in the meantime, my dad and George Lucas, they cornered me and they said, "Hey, calm down, calm down." He says, "This couldn't have gone any better." He says, "You wouldn't have got more exposure if you'd let them start to finish." And so that was my first, that's when, meantime, Shelby was watching all this. And so consequently, because of that, I proved to Shelby. In the meantime, he'd been up to Santa Barbara and the other races and watched me race. And because of that, I was able to drive for him in 1965 when we won the World Championship.
Can you share anything about Le Mans?
About the what?
Le Mans?
Yeah. In 1965, it was our goal again to win the World Championship with the Grand Touring class, which the Cobra was in. In the meantime, Shelby had commissioned Peter Brock, who was one of Shelby's first employees, to design the Daytona Coupe. And then we had to have a Daytona Coupe because the Cobra Roadster itself, even though it was very fast on a short course, the top speed of a Cobra Roadster was about 155. Well, at Daytona, obviously the top speed there were the GT cars, the Ferrari GTOs. They were doing about 170, 175. And of course, in Europe, the tracks were much longer, and especially at Le Mans, in the Mulsanne Straight, the Ferraris would outrun us. But when Peter finished the Daytona Coupe, which is identical to a Roadster, same engine, same transmission, rear end, suspension, everything. The only difference being the shape of the body, being a coupe body. The coupe would do 185 miles an hour, and so consequently, that's the reason we were able to win the World Championship. So in 1965, I told Shelby that I wanted to prepare my own car, and so I actually chose CSX 2300. And I actually tore it down to bare bones and built it back up and prepared it for the 1965 season. I ended up racing it at Daytona, racing it at Sebring. Then we went to Europe, and ironically, I was assigned to drive with Bob Bondurant in Europe. And our first race, and my first race in Europe, was at Mons, Italy, and so consequently, Bob and I won that race, and that was probably one of the thrills of my lifetime. Was being my first race in Europe was at Mons, Italy, which is an incredibly beautiful park-like track, and to win that race was a thrill of a lifetime. From there, we went on to the Tourist Trophy. I raced there in a Roadster, and then I raced at Le Mans, and the racing at Le Mans was really a thrill. People ask, what's it like to go down the Mulsanne Straight? Keep in mind the Mulsanne Straight, it's not like it then was not like it is today. There was no guardrails, there was nothing. All there was a country road with trees on each side of the road, and so consequently we ended up with the Daytona Coupes. We were doing 185 miles an hour, and people will say, well, what was it like, to do 185 miles an hour in a Daytona Coupe? And I refer to the fact, have you ever flown in a Cessna 150 or 172? Just before it takes off, it gets real light and just kind of bounces around a little bit. Well, that's exactly the way the Daytona Coupe feels. One thing I learned, in fact, when I went to Sebring in 1963 as a mechanic, I was actually a crew chief for Phil Hill, and so I got to know Phil Hill quite well. And And Phil Hill was kind of a mentor, and he would give me advice. And one of the things he said is that when you go to Le Mans or any of these tracks, he says you got to force yourself to relax. Your tendency is to want to grip that steering wheel as hard as you can. Well, there's no way you can last 24 hours, or with that kind of stress on your arms. You have to force yourself to relax. And after a while, very frankly, 185 miles an hour, when you slow down to 60 miles an hour, you feel like you can get out and walk because you feel like you're stopped. So it's all relative.
Did you have any interaction with Ken Miles at that time or after at all?
Ken Miles was also an employee of Carroll Shelby, as well as obviously a driver for him, and a test driver, and also engineer. Ken Miles was an excellent driver. Ken Miles was also a very proper English gentleman. But he let us know he was a little arrogant, that he was from the mother country, and that the worst thing I ever heard him say was the fact that when somebody did something he didn't like, he would refer to us as colonists, because. But in the movie Ford versus Ferrari, when I first saw it, and I was fortunate enough to be at the red carpet showing, I could barely watch it because when I saw him throw the wrench and I saw him wrestle with Shelby, and I said, man, this is not Ken Miles. And so consequently, I was very frustrated, and I was telling my daughter about it, who had worked for Disney, and she says, Dad, she says, this is a Hollywood movie. This is not a documentary. And so consequently, he said, next time you see it, just try to get into the story of it. And of course, the ride that Shelby, gave Henry Ford II, in the Ford GT. Well, Henry Ford II came out once, and Shelby gave him a ride in one, but I guarantee you, it was in a Roadster, Ford GT Roadster, and it wasn't anywhere near like it was portrayed in the movie itself. The thing that really frustrated me too was that Phil Remington, who is an incredible man, and I've told many people that if it hadn't been for Phil Remington, Shelby we would not have won the World Championship, and Ford would not have won Le Mans, because Phil Remington was a genius. He was not formally educated, but he could fabricate like nobody in the world, and he could engineer. In fact, it was Phil Remington is the one that actually designed the quick removal and replacement of the calipers and the discs on the Ford GT, because the Ford GT Mark IIs with a 427 engine in it, was a fairly heavy car, and it would go down the Mulsanne Straight at over 200 miles an hour and have to slow down to about 30, 40 miles an hour. And of course, the brakes, they wouldn't uphold it. So Phil's the one that designed the system whereby that we could actually replace the not only the calipers but also the discs. The person that played his role in Ford versus Ferrari, the actor, after the red carpet showing, they had a party and a dinner afterwards, and I introduced myself to the actor that played Phil Remington, and I shared with him the fact that Phil Remington had hired me and I knew him quite well, and I was really disappointed the way he was portrayed. And he looked at me and he says, I agree 100%. He says, when I got the role, I did some research on Phil Remington, and he says, I went to the producers and the powers to be, and I says, this is not Phil Remington. They basically told me, he says, look, this is a movie, this is not a documentary. And so consequently that kind of tells the whole story about the movie. On the whole, though, I was really pleased with the movie, because what it has done, it has brought, to the general public, an idea of what it was like, to go international racing and expose them, to Enzo Ferrari, and also to Ford Motor Company, and the amount of money and effort that Ford put into it, actually to win and finish 1, 2, 3, and win 3 years in a row. It's been very, very good for the industry.